Ladies and gentlemen, could you take your seats, please, for the afternoon session? Firstly, I want to thank Robert for inviting me as chairman of the London Parks and Gardens Trust to chair this afternoon session. I'll do an ad, as Dominic did, and say if anyone's interested in finding out more about the London Parks and Gardens Trust, then do come and see me, and I'll arrange for details to be sent to you. I've got a little bit of housekeeping first. When you leave, which I hope won't be until the end of the afternoon, could you please leave your badges on the table in the entrance hall? Michael Symes has told me that he has an original trade card with him, and if anyone would like to see that, could they talk to him at, well, it'd be tea time, which is after the speakers have spoken. I'm sure most people know Michael, but could you stand up, Michael? Or, yes, there he is. Thank you. This afternoon we've got another fascinating and interesting lineup of speakers. The first speaker is Tim Mowl. He's been a lecturer at Bristol University since 1992 and has recently been promoted to Reader in Architectural and Garden History. He teaches in the Department of Garden History, and he's co-director of the MA in that subject. He's a council member of the GHS and chair of his Education and Publications Committee. And he is himself a prolific and entertaining writer. And his last three books were Gentlemen and Players, which were gardeners of the English landscape, and then Historic Gardens of Gloucestershire and Historic Gardens of Dorset. And these last two are the first in a series, a countrywide series on historic gardens and landscapes, to rival, he says, or perhaps compliment might be a better word, Pevsner's Buildings of England series. Now these, the ones on Gloucestershire and Dorset, will be followed in May 2004 by one on Wiltshire and 2005 by Cornwall. Now in his spare time, if he has any, Tim is researching for a major biography on William Kent, and that will be published by Jonathan Cape in autumn 2005. So please welcome Tim Mowl, who's going to talk about Repton the Sweeper, tidying up after Capability Brown.
Technical problems with my eyes at the moment. Got about 4 boxes here, so they'll probably all fall down in a minute. Oh, there they both are. Lovely men. Okay, now, you mustn't go to sleep. And I must remember people over there. It's rather like being in church, isn't it? You know, nice sort of squint. Can you all see me and can you all hear me? Right, okay. There's so many things here. Right. Well, when I read the order of lectures today, and I saw that I was sandwiched between Hazel Fryer and John Phibbs, with Stephen Daniels to follow, I panicked. I lectured on Repton recently. You probably remember the last time I talked to the Society. And Hazel came up to me afterwards and said meaningfully, "Nice pictures," with obvious implications. While John, who is a dear friend, has only given his lecture the title Planting Peeps from the Boudoir as a kindly alternative to its real title, Why Tim Mowl Got It All Wrong. So I feel, therefore, that it is incumbent upon me to testify to an enormous admiration. No, that's not strong enough. To a deep affection, bordering improperly upon love, for Humphrey Repton, a great gardener and a good man. Now, Some of you may remember last year that iconoclastic lecture I gave, when I was brave enough to suggest that Humphrey might have been just the least little bit of a sham. Well, that was very wrong of me, and I'm here today to do penance, like that holy Roman emperor kneeling in the courtyard of the castle at Canossa, my knees on the icy cobblestones of regret. Humphrey opened my eyes to the social realities of Regency England. Until I read his fragments and observations, I had thought that all those detestable oily creeps in Dickens's novels, men like Uriah Heep and Mr. Chadband, were grotesque caricatures from a diseased imagination. But now I've read Humphrey, and I realise that Dickens got it exactly right. For complex reasons, the Regency was the high watermark of grovelling snobbery and respect as a social way of life. Humphrey Repton just went along with that tide. It wasn't his fault. But it was Stephen Daniels' fault that I fell into uncharitable error, and I am delighted to welcome him here today, for now he can appreciate the influence he has had over me since his great Repton book came out 4 years ago. I treasure it. 248 illustrations of gardens, and not a single one of them a photograph of proven reality. Such a beautiful book about such a hyperactive garden designer. But then, as you know, I started wondering, was Humphrey not so much a garden designer as the patron saint of garden historians, the man who rescued us all when we needed to liven up a lecture? Did we all boost his reputation because of that inspired gimmick of watercolour views with a before and after slide? They are, let's admit it, enchanting toys. Was Humphrey a truly modern figure in that he was an arch salesman? He charged £45 a time. Actually, when I say that, he charged £45 of caution, but André suggests that he sometimes charged 31, 35, £40, 40 guineas, always guineas, sorry, for a red book. And according to John, who has done all the research, as well as André, on the red books, and of course did the gazetteer for Stephen's book, there possibly are 133 of them, maybe as many as 200, André thinks. Well, even if we look at 133 at 45 guineas, that's £6,000. A very substantial sum at the time. Well, I said my Repton piece last year. It was an attack, I admit it, on a reputation possibly swollen beyond its real deserts. And it is healthy today for our society to give a platform to a counterattack. But I must move on. This has not been my Repton and Brown year, it has been my Wiltshire year. Hang on. Oh God, it's very dark here. 80 gardens visited to date in a wonderfully affluent county. Wiltshire is coming out of my ears, and no harm to that. It is a great capability Brown county with Corsham, Bowood, Tottenham Park and Longleat, all major Brownian parks. I might forget to say what these are. You know them all, don't you, anyway? That's why you're here. Longleat, Bowood. But if you don't know what they are, ask me afterwards. I'm conscious I want to keep to time because I want to say everything I've got to say. And I'm frightened of Barbara. Longford Castle brings up the rear, perhaps rather shamefacedly, but I rate Longford's connection with Brown because he came there just for a consultation, and so Lord Radnor told me when I was there this summer, never got paid for it. Not many aristocrats had the nerve to welch on Brown, but the Pledel Bouveries still took his advice and created 2 long axial vistas to give their riverine park some visual depth, one centred on a huge urn, the other on a very Whig statue to King Alfred. Would that I could show you this Whig statue to King Alfred, because it's by Risbrack, and it's fantastic. But I wasn't allowed to take pictures of it, which I did, but I can't show you. Lord Radnor would have me. But that oddity brings me to the modest crux of my brief lecture. When we speak of Humphrey Repton sweeping up after Capability Brown, was there ever a consistent, unvarying Brownian park treatment to tidy up after? On Wiltshire's showing, I doubt it. When Brown was brought in 1764 to Tottenham Park, he found himself with a stupid, obstinate employer, Thomas Brudenell Bruce, later Earl of Aylesbury, with this, to me, on the left, unimpressive brick box of a house by Lord Burlington, and an indecisive garden of old-fashioned avenues focused on Burlington's dull garden buildings. Can you all see the slides? Are they all making sense? Good, right. Garden there before the house, of course. A mile to the north, Savernake Forest began, and then swept on for 3 miles to the edge of Marlborough, a terrain, as Fanny Burney remarked much later on a royal visit, too flat for diversity of prospect. You're looking at the banquet house that Burlington designed as one of those focus points in that old landscape. Now, instead of applying his usual carriage circuit belt and breaking up the avenues with clumps, Brown went riding with Lord Bruce's highly intelligent father-in-law, Henry Hoare of Stourhead, and came up with the grandiose notion, the biggest project Brown ever proposed, I believe, of linking Tottenham Park with Savernake Forest to create a fairish replica of a French royal forest garden of the 17th century. Now, according to this very sketchy map, so sketchy it's difficult to take photographs of it in the Record Office, Trowbridge, Henry Hoare sketched out for his dim son-in-law the forest park, and it would not have just been straight rides meeting in a central clearing, visually unrelated to the house. Brown salved his aesthetic conscience by roughing out open glades, scattered between the rigidly straight lines. The scheme was vainglorious and old-fashioned enough to please Lord Bruce, and planting went ahead with Lord Bruce occasionally insisting on some stupid extra. Listen to this. Like, I shall approve of a clump near the Salisbury Road milestone, and if it is to be a fir, it may be fixed upon for my dear youngest son, who thrives exceedingly, but you must remember to make the clump big enough. Other clumps, some square, some round, were planted in the perfectly good farmland between the forest and the house, but the link between the two areas of the park and forest was never convincingly made. There were common areas, of course, between the two that had to be used for grazing. Yet by 1786, this breathtaking map could be drawn, with a grand avenue starting not from the house, but from the site of a formal canal to the east. Can you all see that, particularly in the slide on the right? Hang on, I've got a pointer. Where's the grand avenue? There it is, look, going up there. In an effort to make that visual link, an enormous second-hand column, taken from Brandenburg House, Hammersmith, was stuck up, and you can just see it from the house front. I never have anything red in any of my slides, so I've just done this as a perversity today. Can you see you can't really see it, can you? You see how far it is anyway. You can see it, good. So how could Repton have swept up after that green elephant? The answer, very easily, by strategically sited park buildings to lead from point to point and to lend character to those vague, common or open areas. But they would have cost a king's ransom, and the Aylesburys were not hugely rich. Forest parks sound attractive, but in my experience they are monotonous. No flowers, no buildings to lure you on, no vistas, just dead leaves and living branches. The Earl's heir was the first Marquis of Aylesbury, who was even less intelligent, building Thomas Cundy's lumbering semi-Palladian barracks around the Burlington block and straining his income on the left. I suppose I'm being smug, but last April I caught the grounds in a deliciously melancholy decay, which quite possibly represented their prime. One horse was left in stables big enough for a Tsar of Russia, on the right. A desolate kitchen garden that could have fed a small town, rhododendron jungles, daffodil drifts, blazes of forsythia in the half-broken giant conservatories. If you want to enjoy it, get in fast, because a leisure complex is proposed, and much of the charm will be lost forever in tidiness and trimming. Wonderful conservatory that appears on Cundy's designs for the rebuilding of the house. Hazel's actually done quite a lot of work on Tottenham, so she can tell you more about that part of it, the 1820s part. But as you can see, wonderful, wonderful atmospheric decay. Got it just in time. The house is being used by a drug rehabilitation group called Amber. And I rang up about it to get in, and I got a man on the phone, and I said, "Who are you then?" And he said, "Cardigan." "Right, my name's Sweater." Don't you love aristocrats? Bowood and Longleat were given a far more conventional Brownian makeover. Dam a river to create a lake, set a team of skilled labourers to drain and smooth the slopes around it, plant strategic tree clumps to raise land profiles and diversify bland areas, and then get out with the money. Brown was often that crude and that hasty. Luck played a bigger part in creating a successful brown parkscape than we tend to admit. It was all in the contours, as Bowood and Longleat prove. Bowood is probably Brown's most beautiful lake, yet he failed completely to dramatise it. A high earth dam spread the water back up several little side valleys with a natural-looking diversity of inlets. At Longleat, the Leat runs in a trench. As a result, the lake Brown made over the second Lord Weymouth's double serpentine — I'm showing you the Ladd map of 1747 on the right, with the double serpentine done by Viscount Weymouth in the late 1730s, early 1740s. The serpentine that Brown laid over that one still looks to me like a reservoir for Birmingham, even after Repton roughed up the banks to hide the smooth curves. But when you drive into Bowood from the Golden Gates, there is that terrific coup d'oeil of the lake below you in almost all its length, but with just enough invisible to suggest there is more out of sight. The trouble was that Brown just left it like that, with no focus points. One wonders, did Brown ever visit Stourhead? Interesting, isn't it? Johnny might know. Yet in 1761, as the lake was filling up, Robert Adam was building a superb domed mausoleum in the park. Down by the lakeside, it would have composed fabulously like Stourhead's Pantheon, but it is hidden away in the remote quarried west of the park, visually useless. Could Brown not have persuaded Lord Shelburne on its siting? And that's Lord Shelburne's tomb on the right by Adam in there. Fantastic building, set in the middle of a 19th and 20th century rhododendron garden. Well, that was his first problem, and his first failure. Today there is a white Doric temple at the east or earth dam end of the lake, composing excellently, but it had to be moved there in 1864. Brown had sited it away behind the house in a private pleasure area. His second failure. The third was the cascade. Can you show that one on the right, because that's quite a good picture. I've given it you in summer and in winter. It's not by Brown. He designed a mill to use the lake's head of water, and that was never built, as being too industrial for a park. That ingeniously right-angled cascade that we admire today was made to Hamilton of Painshill's suggestion, and the rather inferior group of 8 pocket-sized caves around it were inevitably by the lanes of Tisbury. Repton only visited Bowood for one day, 21st of August, 1797, to advise on a greenhouse. If he had been allowed to sweep up after Brown, he would have improved the horrid cavelets and, with his fondness for white focal buildings, moved the Doric temple long before 1864. In my view, Brown had no feeling for a general Arcadia of garden buildings. I'm really talking post Crewe, of course. And most of those were done by Adam anyway. He could design good Greek temple lodges, as at Winstay, out on park perimeters, or eclectic charmers close up to a house, as at Sherborne and Burley. Sherborne on the left, the dairy, and Burley, the greenhouse, on the right. But his parks tend to bear grass. When a carriage stopped, there was nothing to explore, only pheasants to shoot, so presumably carriages in a Brownian park just kept moving. The fourth failure at Bowood is that odd, picturesque cottage. Now, can we see it in these slides? They're pretty dark, but it's there and it's there. All right, you got it? There and there. And that's the landing stage. That's quite important. Landing stage and cottage. A village house with no supporting village. It is, of course, post-Brown, but his lake had severed a road to Calne, and a ferry had legally to be supplied. This was the ferryman's cottage. It has an inappropriate suburban air. A temple cottage or tower would have composed better on that prominent mid-lake site. I suspect that Brown was so money-orientated with his team of workers that his priority was to get on to the next job as soon as the dig, ditch, drain, plant process was over. It would explain the state he left Corsham in. Oh, you're going to do that, yeah. I've never quite recovered from finding that the Gothic Cascade House at Doddington, a truly poetic and Arcadian mid-part structure, was not by Brown at all, but by the owner, Christopher Bethel Codrington, and his little group of amateur artists. Brown was an engineer first, a technician. Aesthetics came second, largely a byproduct of good drainage. Repton was the reverse. He could envisage, paint the vision, but then falter on the technology, as at Corsham, where he was called in by Paul Cobb Methuen in 1796 to create, paradoxically, the Brownian landscape that Brown had failed to create in 1763 for Paul Methuen, the father. Isn't that beautiful? That's a really rare slide, that is. James Dyson's bought the house, as you know, and I managed to get him with one of my MA students whose husband works for him, but I had a wonderful time there this summer. Corsham is a very damp site. The conduit house is 16th century. It fed the Brown Nash bath house. Let's get that. Oh, you've got that, and then we want the next one. And then drained into Brown's very deep ha-has that doubled then, as now, as drainage ditches, before filling a vaguely round pond near the house. The Andrews and Jury view on the right, from their 1770s map of the whole county, it's immediately post-Brown and pre-Repton, shows how uninspired the layout was. A great walk to the north, that one, a sunk fence around the garden. Can you see the fence coming around the garden like so? And cutting off the churchyard, and the water in the park. Is the water in the park, just here. Brown's earth dam must have been too small and too near the house. He was very involved with complicated additions to the house in 3 different styles, so the park got minimal attention. Repton's Red Book, now I believe lost, proposed the obvious, a true Brownian long lake held up by a more ambitious dam planted with trees. He supplied this sketch on the left with some ham-fisted and very vague directions and dimensions for James Sharp and Dudley Clark, the actual contractors working for Methuen's steward Clutterbuck, to follow. It read that the dam should include the weir, the tompion or sluice, the puddles, and I wish also were included the puddles and bank round some trees, which I have endeavoured to preserve near the head. That was all. If you find that technically impressive, you should read Dudley Clark's 2-page, 12-item specification for the embankment, written 27 days later on the 23rd of Feb, 1797. It has a precise 170-word description of the puddle gutter alone, and the dimension of the embankment to be 15 feet broad at the top. Humphrey said 30. 10 foot 6 inches from the bottom to top of the dam. Humphrey suggested 14 feet. Obviously, to the men in charge of the work, Humphrey was an irrelevance. Even the island in the near lake was created not by Repton as a natural feature, but by Dudley Clark, writing to Clutterbuck on the 24th of February, 1797, calculating, I suppose there will be some islands formed in different places. 4,000 cubic yards at 4 halfpenny to 5 per cubic yard, forming the sides, amounts to £83, 6 shillings and 8 pence. That was the true origin of an idyllic garden feature, a contractor's financial calculation of the cost of carting surplus earth. Meanwhile, poor Repton was in disgrace with Paul Cobb Methuen, because he had tried to charge him twice for a 10-guinea account. Methuen produced Repton's receipt and firmly reduced the bill. Endless grovelling letters in Pecksniffian vein followed from Repton on the lines of, I am ashamed to have been guilty of such an error as you have described. The truth is that I had, during that journey in 1795, received 20 guineas of you and 10 from another gentleman who was not so careful or so accurate. Continue page 94, as Private Eye says. Later, Repton wrote a very Humphrey letter urging the Methuens to employ him on £100 a year retainer, copying the Duke of Portland, Lord Newark, Lord Berwick, and concluding, I hope I have made no mistake with respect to money you have paid me on account. though I confess I am so little at home that it is with some difficulty I can keep my affairs with that degree of regularity which business requires. Methuen did not take up the offer of the £100 retainer, even when Repton tried to ingratiate himself with Mrs. Methuen. This, I suggest, is the real Repton. A good watercolourist with a vague knowledge of hydraulics and shifty accounting. The lake, it's almost invisible, by the way, from the house, is his, or is it Dudley Clark's, or is it Clutterbuck's? I'd opt for Clark. I certainly wouldn't opt for Humphrey. And as you can see, I've taken a shot of it from the house. Composes beautifully in the far distance, doesn't it? In the year 1797 that Dudley Clark was making the Corsham Lake, Repton was making a red book for James Sutton of Roundway Park. Actually, it was called New Park. It's now called Roundway, a mile outside Devizes, to suggest how the dashing white house that James Wyatt had just built for Sutton could be set off by new grounds. 8 of the red book illustrations have survived, including number 1, the vital estate map, numbered to pinpoint the 7 views. Repton's proposals are imaginative, seductive, and un-Brownian. A utility drive. Let me, oh no, I've lost it now. It's very dark here. Where is it? There it is. A utility drive, this one, into the house, was to connect with the London Devizes Road, but a scenic drive was to wind down a steep valley over a new lake to a remote lodge, White and Templar. You see it? There's the lodge, bridge, up to the house. Roundway House itself stood on a plateau with steep, near cliff-like woodland slopes west and south. That's one of the woodland slopes, particularly there, which we will come back to. And here, with Arcadian shepherd and sheep on the left, is how Repton envisaged the house as painted from the top of Roundway Down, and I'm showing you Roundway Down on the right. His innovative proposal was for a walker's picturesque circuit in place of a Brownian carriage drive. Very interesting. He's a lot more interested in walkers, in my view, than Brown. Let me take you round it with 4 before and after slides and 3 straight watercolours. First comes this view, north before descending the valley. An unusual side-pulled slide improves the view by cutting back pine trees to reveal a winding road. This is Repton in his let's enjoy life and humanity mood. And then a before and after view of the valley, down the valley, the new river, the river come lake, and a white cottage. Can you see it there? There should be, there it is. And there's the lake. At the foot of the valley, Repton proposes, before and after, a rock grotto cut out of the cliff, 2 genteel walkers resting inside, a nice new fence, and the usual deer abounding. Stepping off the walker's circuit and going on down the scenic carriage drive, this is how Repton envisaged the improved approach to the house along the drive and over the new river lake by a bridge. Only now his mood has gone idyllic. Hedges are nasty, open parkland is nice. In my view, Repton has no consistent aesthetic on the warm humanity, cool idyll continuum. But the walker's route breaks off from the drive to climb back up steps through a wooded cliff to the plateau again. Here is a before and after view showing how the new white Templar lodge could focus the view in the valley. And I hope you can see that originally it was a red cottage and now it's become a white Templar lodge. That explains why I think Repton would have advanced Bowood more aesthetically, made it better than Brown had left it. He knew the value of a white building. The wooded grove with shady walks which Repton proposed for the southeast corner of the walker's route would soon be destroyed by the cutting of the Kennet and Avon Canal. Yeah, good. But immediately behind the house was a second wood with more walks wrapped around the kitchen garden. You can see that on the slide on the left, and the view on the right is looking at the back of the house, showing those woods. Ideal, of course, for old ladies, and of course ideal for Repton once he was in a wheelchair. It adds up to an attractive proposal. But let us face the not unusual Humphrey reality. This isn't a pregnant pause, I've lost my place. An attractive map of Roundway, the property and residence of Edward Francis Corston, Esquire, made in 1841, proves that there is no river, lake or bridge. The scenic drive therefore follows a shorter course. There are no steps up the cliff wood and no grotto. The lodge has been sited much further out on the road. There is no wood with shady walks around the kitchen garden, no sign either of a walker's circuit of paths. Do I leave the conclusion up to you? As Hazel said, nice pictures. Now, I can't show you that 1841 map, and I'm not making it up. It's just that it's got so much melamine on it, you can't photograph it. But it is in Trowbridge, and I can give you the shelf mark should you want it. Now, Humphrey's Red Book of 1804 for Longley makes far more positive story. Again, the idyllic nostalgia of an opening view, the shepherd this time with his pipe, not his sheep. Humphrey's been called in primarily to design a fishing lodge for the more private shearwater, not the main lake. I'm sorry these are so dark, but I had to take them in a room that had no windows at all, under constant supervision, and that's the best I could do. Here, Repton's approach is far more architectural. Clearly, the Thinns have money to spend. The year is 1804, and Geoffrey Wyatville is 1801 to 11, reshaping things in good Jacobean pastiche. You can feel the wave of 19th century eclecticism about to break, and Repton, who I still maintain was essentially without an excessive aesthetic credo, but a creature of the cusp, ready to conform to any owner's whim, goes pure Wyatville, except in the circa 1520 fishing lodge, with a keeper's flat above and picnic rooms below, both with kitchens. Exactly what Derek Adlam was saying earlier on, this sort of historicist line in him. And there's the fishing pavilion, and I went to see if I could find it, and the bottom arch survives, and they've had a 1930s bungalow put on top of it. As Hazel said this morning, walk the site, find out what's there. See how in a gate lodge design, Repton readily conforms to that very Regency contempt for the living conditions of a lodge keeper's family. One room doubles for back kitchen and bedroom. They slept in the kitchen, yet the exterior looks almost sumptuous. Humphrey's sumptuous squalor. In a robust return to the notion of an Arcadia of buildings, but with the Jacobean substituted for the Greek and Roman, Repton designed this pleasure pavilion to stand above the pheasantry, the site of the Grove in the London and Wise 17th century formal layout. On your right, of course, are the stables by Wyatville to show you how connected they are in style, and also, of course, to the main house. And here, in a before and after, is how the pavilion would look from Longleat House with children at play. The pavilion, of course, was never built, but this, remember, is a Humphrey Repton projection. Sounds like a film, doesn't it? Here is Repton's plan for the remodelling of Brown's Lake. In 1804, Repton was intent upon the natural and the informal. Notice how he has softened up the banks of the big lake, obliterating most signs of that smooth Rococo serpentine. The house, in both views from Heaven's Gate, sits apparently on open lawns or even a field. Was Repton doing a Payne night, a Uvedale Price, or was he going back to Capability Brown? I suspect the latter. Certainly the effect of this is anything but Gardenesque. The bridge concerned Repton, but in his Humphrey mode, he could not make up his mind whether it should have 5 or 7 arches, or whether they should be longer or smaller. That must depend, he concluded, on experiments on the spot, after the channel shall have been accurately marked out. Poor Humphrey Repton, it looked as though things were going technical again. What a lovely man. And that is my admittedly sceptical angle on the Brown-Repton interaction. I frankly regret Brown for ending the reign of the Arcadian Park and substituting for it the Park Beautiful and boring. Repton never had the vision to suggest and then to demonstrate an alternative style. What we would have to wait was 100 years for the Edwardians before this country recovered its nerve in park design. But just to communicate, as Repton did brilliantly, the possibility of landscape improvement was no mean achievement. All I'm saying today on my analysis of Repton's work in just one county is that he does not come up as a significant creator, but I'm ready to learn if and where I've got it wrong. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim, for that unique and irreverent take on Brown and Repton. Our next speaker is John Phibbs, who's principal of Du Bois Landscape Survey Group. They are renowned consultants in the field of historic landscapes, although I found it very difficult to actually find details on the web or elsewhere about the projects they've been involved in, but everyone says they have been involved in a tremendous number of important landscapes. And John Sayles this morning tells me that he discovered John Phibbs many years ago. And indeed, the first Repton landscape that John worked on was at Wimpole in 1978. And since then, he's written management plans and reports on several dozen others. His work concentrates on practical field work rather than on a study of documents. But in addition to reports and management plans, he has written a number of important articles. And one of his early contributions to the Garden History Journal outlined an approach to the methodology of recording historic landscapes. As a result of this work, John has become fascinated by Repton's Red Books. And the title of his talk today is not Why Tim Mowl is Wrong, but Planting Peeps from the Boudoir, Useful Preliminaries to Reading a Repton Red Book. So welcome, John Phibbs.
I've got a bit of a problem, really. I was prevented from saying that my title could be Why Tim is Wrong, but actually it would be a jolly good title, I think. And I'm not... We've got a bit of a problem. We seem to be a Garden History Society coming to discuss and celebrate the work of one of the 4 or 5 greatest designers of English landscape. And so far, the score is sort of Repton 0, Australia, whatever it is, 30 or something. And, it seems that all Repton did was draw a few red books, and that was that, and had no effect on the ground at all. And this is... so I am batting for Repton as a designer. And what I'm going to do is weave a rather clever path. The kind of cleverness that doesn't really last much beyond the lecture room, but we'll have a go. Because my take on the Red Books is slightly different from many of the other speakers. And the one the key one, we can start with the pictures. I have to do that, right? Green is forward, yeah? And I have talked about this before to the Garden History Society, is this Red Book for Catch French, which is in Cornwall. And what is so remarkable about it to me is that it becomes very clear in this Red Book that the Red Book was, what he put in the Red Book was not really what he did. What happens in Cat French? Hang on, I'm going to find this. Where's it? Something I can. Where's the pencil thing? Is that it? Okay. There we go. This is his before picture for Cat French, and it shows the house complete, and it shows this walled garden, rather naked, and some farm buildings and whatnot. And it's absolutely clear from the plan for Cat French and the text that when Repton arrived, this wall garden hadn't been built, but it's in his before picture. Furthermore, now I'm going to press another button. It's so there's his after picture showing it all as he thought it'd be finished. However, not only had the wall garden and the farm buildings not been built, we have a date for them of 1800 or so, in other words, just after the Red Book. But the house never got finished at all. There's the house today. It's obviously had a bit of retreatment. But half of it remained in Elizabethan ruin and has never been anything else. And so we have what appears to be a before picture, which is actually not before at all. It's after Repton has done a certain number of works, and it's where he's anticipating the completion of a house that never actually got completed. Similarly here, this is his famous view where he was going to cut the earth away. And this Mowl plantation, which is an immensely sophisticated piece of planting by Repton, is described in his Red Book as something existing, but it wasn't. It was set out when he was there. Oh, we'll move on to, is that going to be, no, that was the panic button. I pressed the panic button. Of course. Okay. I know I have talked about this before, but the simple solution to this problem is that the so-called before pictures in Repton's Red Books aren't necessarily before pictures at all. And if you deconstruct the Catch French book, you'll find 5 or 6 different versions of the landscape implicit in one Red Book. So there's the landscape that was there before Repton arrives. There's the landscape that he then sets out with his white stakes. And don't tell me he doesn't do it, because we've seen pictures of Stoneleigh, thank you very much, showing the setting out. You can see the same at Sarsden and so on, where the work was undoubtedly done. So you've got the landscape he sets out. He then goes away for 6 months. You've then got the landscape that actually gets constructed. And on the plan for Catch French, which I haven't shown a picture of, is penciled on the kitchen garden. But it's penciled on typically in slightly the wrong place from where it got built. So Repton has penciled it onto the plan, knowing that that's where he'd set it out, but he hasn't actually got it exactly right. There's then the Red Book's portrayal in its before pictures of the landscape as he thought it was after he'd done this initial setting out. And then there are his proposals, which are things that may or may not happen. So, which he projects he proposes for the future. So you can see the Catch French Red Book, the after pictures, not as showing what Repton proposed or what he did, but almost as showing what he didn't do. So a Red Book could almost be a record of what didn't happen, or what at least was dubious. And this is emphasized in the Catch French Red Book, where he says he's not going to talk about proposals and approaches and so on, which are plantations and approaches. He's going to record things that came up in conversation, and this phrase has occurred elsewhere. It comes up a lot in his Red Books. And this phrase he uses, almost a key phrase that's always worth, it's always worth looking at. Sorry, I hadn't quite realized. It is off-putting, but delightful. And this phrase he uses is things that came up in conversation. In other words, he did his setting out, which was all agreed, where the farm was going to go at Catch French, where the walled garden was going to go, where the approaches were going to go, where the plantations were going to go, where the Mowl plantation was going to go. Things came up in discussion, and he said, well, okay, I'll do you a sketch of how I think it's going to look. And so those are the things that are slightly more dubious. And indeed, in the Catch French Red Book, the after proposals, like the tower on the lodge, as Tim has pointed out, doesn't get built. I'm not saying that's true of every Red Book, but you certainly have to read a Red Book with an immense amount of care if you're actually going to distinguish things he discusses as existing. You want to be quite certain in your own mind that he really meant that. And having introduced, therefore, the Red Book as almost the reverse of what Tim and Hazel have found, I can certainly endorse their finding that an awful lot of the stuff in the red books isn't there on the ground, so this implementation rate seems to be very low. But another thing for you to look at in red books when you're trying to read them is the sometimes very obliquely he'll refer to the fact that he has been setting out and I tried to check this with André, and I have actually got the percentage of the red books I've read where he talks about things being staked out or set out or something beforehand. That's the work that he's doing on the ground, and the best account of Repton that I know implementing his work on the ground is this famous 1834 review by James Main of Henry Stewart's book on planting in Gardeners magazine, which I haven't brought along. But it talks about him rushing around with thorn trees, which he particularly likes, and showing where they're all going to go and that kind of thing. That's at Chalfont. To endorse what Tim was saying about the red books, and indeed André, they can almost be regarded as a separate industry that he was running besides his landscape business. And as I would have said that the amount of money he earned was even more than Tim has suggested out of the red books, at a time when it was immensely difficult to make money as a landscape gardener. So the red books were a very important part of his income. And someone you can compare him with, whose contemporary is Sam Reynolds, who worked, I think he followed Repton at Stoneleigh, and he worked at Bedwell and Ashburnham and Southall. Obviously his main places are Southall and Colworth. And he, at his peak in I'm not going to find the place now, here we go, yes I am. At his peak in 1812, he's writing, you know, I'm as poor as him who has no money and has overdrawn his banker. And then again, "'Twere better for me not to pursue such a line any longer. Many would turn it to more profit than I can." He's finding it terribly difficult to make ends meet as a landscape gardener, despite having the patronage of Beaumont and Payne and Price as a picturesque designer. And Loudon, who began again as a landscape gardener, was bankrupted really by what happened at Stradsit, where he took over from Repton, or took the contract from Repton. And the Red Book so was a money maker, but it also fantastically confined Repton in what he could do. There's been references to his so-called oleaginous style, and I would also refer to the immense limitations put on his Red Books by the fact that he had to confine himself, or chose to confine himself, to aesthetics, so that you get, in all of his Red Books, in all the 100 and something or other that I've looked at, only about 8 or 9 other activities are referred to in all the Red Books, besides the sort of aesthetic one of views and so on. And you saw, Hazel showed the picture of Sheringham with the temple and 3 or 4 pheasants on the right-hand side. I don't know if you saw that. But that's about all the interest that sport gets in Repton's Red Books. And I think the reason for that is that aesthetics, just as when you go to buy a car nowadays, you want to know if it's pink or if the line's right or whatever. You don't actually worry about the engine. The aesthetics are a way of valuing the outcome of a work, and it's assumed that Repton is going to get all the nitty-gritty of, is there enough grass for the horses, where does the arable go, how does this whole unit work? You assume he's going to get all that right. And what he's selling in the Red Book is simply aesthetics. But aesthetics is a very, very narrow channel, art history sort of channel, through which to try and read landscape. Which landscape is a vastly complicated agricultural sporting enterprise. David, don't fall asleep. David in the front row. And there's another thing relating to this concept of politeness, which I know Tom Williamson's taken on, and indeed Tim, that I think that it's very easy to imagine that the whole of the 18th century is swept by this sort of politeness and this more and more egregious sort of writing. But actually this is absolutely not the point, and not the case. There was a far stronger impulse in the 18th century towards impoliteness. And the greatest, whereas on the polite side you have Repton, most of the architects, Nash, Joshua Reynolds, of course, trying to elevate painting into a gentlemanly pursuit. David Garrett doing the same for acting. On the other hand, you've got Dr. Johnson, Brown, Capaldi Brown, Kent, the Wild Goth from Hull, Gainsborough, Hogarth, Stubbs, all of them saying, I don't want to go abroad, I don't want to learn anything about Europe, I'll sit in my squalor in my studio, and I'm genuine. Hogarth versus Reynolds. And Repton chose to be one of those who would elevate landscape gardening into a polite profession. And that's why I think a lot of his writing is so different from Brown's, which is very direct, straightforward. I'm digging the gravel pit, I'm making the lake. And don't want to talk too much about Brown, but Tim's account is such a travesty. I cannot believe. Why wasn't there a popular revolution when he started talking this nonsense? Anyway, he's a witty fellow, such a nice man. And I also take issue with the business of whether he was a good watercolorist. No, that's not the right button. This one is. This is Sundridge, and we've seen some pictures of Sundridge. I think André showed them earlier. This is the house as was built. And here's the Repton view out. And to my mind, his watercolors, as a way of introducing you to landscape, if you're trying to think of this not as a painter only, but as an introduction to landscape, are remarkably flat. And if you compare them to Kent's, again I haven't got the picture, but Kent's drawings of Hokum and so on, somehow you're being drawn into a Kent, you're being drawn up the hill and round the temples, and Kent's landscapes may be less good as art, but they're much more, they make you want to go in and explore the ground. That one you don't want to go and look at at all, frankly. You want to stay inside. And when you look at the view today, you can see that in real life, the landscape, which I agree has been totally carved out by golf courses and all the rest of it, but the landscape just in a photograph, which tends to flatten things, still has much more depth than Repton was able to show in the real landscape. And I question whether his watercolors weren't, again, a bit of a failure, because he was a failure, that's to say, for him promoting his ideas as a landscape gardener, because he was trying to make them polite. And this is exactly the point that came up earlier. What sort of tradition was he in? Well, he was very definitely trying to make landscape, to my mind, conform to polite rules of painting design. He wasn't trying to do Gerting. He wasn't trying to be revolutionary, because that wasn't the point. Tom Williamson, very nice man. Actually, he is. He wrote quite a bit about this idea. Turning to the Repton-Brown connection, which is actually very interesting. He tried to create a theory, has tried to create a theory, I don't know if he still sticks to it, that a landscape has a kind of organic process of growth and decay, and that after Brown, after Repton, somehow or other, they had reached some organic peak, something inherent in the landscape. I don't think that's the case. I think that Brown, Repton, and everyone else was much more answering to fashion, changes in taste, and technological change. And I think Repton was doing that as well. I would emphasize